Welcome back, everyone. So let's talk about functional components. A functional component typically takes the form of an arrow function. Arrow functions at this point are the norm of writing functions. And the way that we want to replicate, let's say, this app component is we would say const app the same way that we said class app. So we're initializing some constant variable named app. And we want it to be equal to a function. That is pretty much all you need as far as the boilerplate of a functional component goes. You don't need this constructor, you don't need these lifecycle methods, you don't need the render. These are all things that are only unique to class components. These are methods attached to a class. Functions, in this particular case, and functional components are pure functions, meaning that all React is going to do is run this function top to bottom. Whatever gets returned finally from this function is going to be the UI that this function returns. So in turn, what we return from our class component is inside of the render, in this return statement in our render method. But with a functional component, whatever you return inside of the function is going to be the same UI. So let's just copy that over and paste it into this return. This right here is your functional component. What you see inside of here is enough to get a functional component working, assuming you have all your variables. In our particular case, we don't, but just so that I can show you what I mean, I'm going to comment everything else out that is a component and just render an H1 because nothing inside of this function is reliant on any of that. And here our class component is now in conflict because we have two matching variables, both named app. We have our const and we have our class. So I'm just going to comment out the class. And just to show you that this is all it takes, now our app is a functional component. Now we save and we go look inside our application. We see our title, so we know that our functional component is working because it's all we're rendering from this functional component. Now, before we start moving and figuring out how our functional component can reflect all of those other functionalities that we had in our class component, let's break down the differences immediately when it comes to the mounting phase with a functional component. Clearly, when we look at this functional component, there's no constructor method because constructor, as we know, is related to classes. Because there's no constructor and no class, a functional component behaves as you would expect a regular JavaScript function to do. And all a JavaScript function does is it takes some arguments and it returns something. In this particular case, a React functional component takes arguments that are the props of this component, and then it returns JSX. That's all it is. A function, when it gets invoked, runs from top to bottom, and then that function is done with. So unlike our classes, which get instantiated, and then there are all these different numerous lifecycle methods or constructor method or render method that are related to class components, that are constantly being kept alive and being run and invoked depending on what phase a class component is in, functional components do not do that. Instead, React takes your functional component, which is just a simple function, and it says, oh, I need this component. I'm just going to run this function and just return whatever returns. Once I've returned it onto the page, I'm done with it. React under the hood will keep a reference to that component and, of course, the functional component that instantiated it. But as far as you're concerned, the simplicity of a functional component is like a JavaScript function. It just runs from top to bottom, and then that's it. Here, with our functional app component during the mounting phase, React is essentially saying, oh, you gave me this function. I'm just going to run it and just return that HTML JSX, which was inside of your return of this function, and then that's all I'm going to do with it. That's a very important thing to note because functional components do not go through life cycles the way that we typically think about when we're talking about class components. It's almost an entirely different mental model. Sometimes when you read different guides on React, you will see people talking about functional components going through similar methods and using similar hooks that replicate life cycles. This is actually very misguiding because there are no life cycles when it comes to functional components. You have to think about it in a completely different way. And the way you want to think about them is in the concept of functions and side effects. What are side effects? In order for us to understand side effects, we need to understand pure functions and impure functions, which we'll cover in the next video. The reason why you need to know about functions, pure functions, impure functions, and side effects is because in order for us to replicate all of the behavior that we had in our class components with state and with set state and with lifecycle methods, we need to understand this idea of side effects. So we'll talk about that in the next video. Remember, without understanding functions, pure functions, impure functions, and side effects, you won't be able to fully grasp the way that React handles functional components. So in the next video, let's talk about it.